Every time someone says they'd rather play an old game than the newest $70 release, someone else says the same thing. That's just nostalgia. But that's lazy psychology. Nostalgia is a real, documented emotion. A warm, bittersweet longing for the past. But it doesn't explain why 15-year-olds who never owned a Game Boy are obsessed with Pokemon Red. It doesn't explain why Celeste and Stardew Valley, brand new games built like old ones, outsell titles with 10 times the budget. And it doesn't explain why this pattern shows up identically across totally different cultures, continents, and even different US states with no shared childhood memory at all. Something else is going on. Something structural. Something psychological. Let's break it down properly. Today's title is Why Gamers Prefer Old Games and Why It's Not Nostalgia. Section 1. Constraints Made Better Designers. Old games had brutal limitations, tiny memory, no patches, no day one DLC. If a game shipped broken, it stayed broken. So developers were forced to nail the core loop before release. Every mechanic had to earn its place because there was no room, literally, for filler. In psychology, there's a concept called the paradox of choice, the idea that too many options actually reduce satisfaction rather than increase it. Modern games, unconstrained by memory or budget, often drown players in choice. 40 skill trees, hundreds of cosmetic items, dozens of overlapping systems. Old games couldn't do that. They were forced into cognitive parsimony. Simplicity that reduces mental clutter and makes the experience easier for your brain to process and enjoy. Think about Tetris, one mechanic endlessly deep, still one of the most replayed games in history. That's not an accident. That's elegant design constraint meeting a low cognitive load, which is exactly what makes something easy to learn but hard to put down. Section 2. Respect for your time, the psychology of reward design. This is the real reason, and it's not emotional, it's structural. Modern games are increasingly engineered around variable ratio reinforcement, the same psychological mechanism behind slot machines, where rewards arrive unpredictably so your brain never stops checking. B.F. Skinner proved decades ago that unpredictable rewards create the most persistent, hardest-to-break behavior of any reinforcement schedule. Daily logins, loot boxes, battle passes, these aren't accidents. They're operant conditioning applied directly to a controller. Every time you open a loot box, your brain gets a small hit of dopamine, not from the reward itself, but from the anticipation of it. Neuroscientists call this the reward prediction error. Dopamine actually spikes more from uncertainty than from the reward landing. That's the exact mechanism casinos are built on, and it's now baked into game design under the polite name engagement. Old games didn't have live service incentives, so they couldn't lean on that loop. Instead, they relied on intrinsic motivation, the drive to play because the act itself is satisfying, not because an external reward schedule is pulling you back in. Self-determination theory, a major framework in motivational psychology, says humans are intrinsically motivated when 3 needs are met: autonomy, competence, and relatedness. Old games hit autonomy and competence hard. You controlled the character, and the game clearly told you when you got better, without needing an artificial rewards calendar to keep you hooked. The studio got paid once at the register, so their only job was to make the 40 hours you had actually good. That's the difference between a game designed for flow and a game designed for a compulsion loop. And your brain can tell the difference, even if you can't always articulate why. Section 3. Mechanical skill over spectacle, flow, mastery, and self-efficacy. There's also in what counts as a good game. Old games leaned almost entirely on mechanics, tight controls, readable patterns, fair difficulty, because they didn't have cinematic budgets to fall back on. That forced mastery to be the reward, not the graphics. Psychologist Mihai Csikszentmihalyi coined the term flow to describe a state of total absorption when a challenge is perfectly matched to your skill level. Not so easy it's boring, not so hard it triggers frustration and disengagement. He called this the flow channel. Too much challenge and you get anxiety. Too little and you get boredom. The sweet spot in between is where games like Super Mario Bros. And Mega Man live. Old games, with their tight feedback loops, were almost accidentally engineered for flow. There's also contingency of reinforcement at work, a strong, immediate link between your input and the outcome. When you die in an old platformer, you instantly know it was your timing, not a hidden system rolling dice behind the scenes. That immediate, honest feedback builds what psychologists call self-efficacy. Albert Bandura's term for your belief in your own competence, built through direct mastery experiences. Every clean jump, every perfect parry, deposits a little more self-efficacy in the bank. And then there's Dark Souls, brutal, unforgiving, and one of the most beloved franchises of the last decade among players far too young to be nostalgic for anything it references. Its difficulty isn't punishment for its own sake. It's effort justification, a well-documented cognitive bias where the harder you work for an outcome, the more rewarding it feels once you get it. Combine that with the IKEA effect, we value things more when we've put labor into them ourselves, and you get a psychological explanation for why hard but fair games create obsessive fans, while easy but generous games get abandoned after a weekend. Section 4. The indie proof. Here's the strongest evidence this isn't nostalgia. The games proving this theory right are brand new. Celeste, Undertale, Hollow Knight, Stardew Valley. None of these are remasters. They're new games, built by small teams deliberately copying old-school design philosophy. Tight mechanics, no live service bloat, a real ending. They're some of the most successful games of the last 10 years. Proof that when you strip away extrinsic reward scaffolding and rebuild a game around intrinsic motivation and flow, players respond, regardless of when they were born. That's not a coincidence. That's a market telling developers exactly what psychology already predicted. Section 5. It's not just one culture's story, global experiences. And this isn't just an American gaming trend. It shows up everywhere for different reasons, which is itself important because if the cause were nostalgia, you'd expect it to look different in every culture. Instead, it converges. In Europe, the relationship runs through PC culture, demo scenes, shareware, LucasArts adventure games, and the modding communities that grew out of games like Doom. European players often describe less of a specific memory attachment and more of a culture of tinkering. Old games were open enough to take apart, remix, and rebuild, satisfying what psychologists call exploratory drive, an innate motivation to understand and manipulate your environment, something increasingly locked down in modern, DRM-heavy live service titles. In Africa, the story is shaped by access. Older games run on older, cheaper hardware, a real factor when consoles and high-end PCs are expensive or hard to import. Mobile ports of retro-style games and second-hand consoles have made old-school design the practical entry point into gaming for a huge and fast-growing player base, especially in countries like Nigeria, Kenya, and South Africa. For many players there, old school isn't a throwback. It's simply accessible. And accessibility maps directly onto competence, one of the 3 core needs in self-determination theory, because a game you can actually run and afford to master builds far more psychological reward than one you can only watch on YouTube. Section 6. The American experience, state by state. Even within one country, the experience isn't uniform, and that variation is exactly why nostalgia alone can't explain this pattern. In California, the story is industrial. Silicon Valley and the Bay Area birthed Atari, and Southern California became home to studios like Blizzard and Activision. Californians' attachment to old games is often tangled up with identity fusion, the psychological merging of personal identity with a group or culture, in this case, being someone who grew up in gaming's birthplace. In Washington state, it's Nintendo of America's headquarters in Redmond and Microsoft's Xbox division a few miles away. 2 competing philosophies of game design coexisting in the same metro area. Players there often frame old games in terms of craftsmanship narratives, valuing the perceived integrity of first-party Nintendo design. In Texas, arcade culture and LAN party culture ran deep through the 90s and 2000s, especially around Dallas and Houston, home to ID Software, creators of Doom. Texan gaming communities often emphasize social facilitation, the psychological finding that people perform and enjoy activities more intensely in the presence of others, which explains the enduring pull of couch co-op and split-screen classics over solitary modern live service grinding. In New York, the story leans toward arcade nostalgia layered onto dense urban social space, Chinatown and Coney Island arcades, and later, competitive fighting game communities. This taps into social identity theory belonging to a recognizable in-group, like the fighting game community, built around shared mastery of decades-old titles like. And in the Midwest and Rust Belt states, Ohio, Michigan, Illinois, economic contraction in the 2000s and 2010s coincided with a resurgence of retro gaming and emulation communities, which some psychologists tie to nostalgic coping during periods of collective uncertainty. But critically, this is coping through engagement with well-designed systems, not simple sentimentality. The design quality is still doing the psychological work. The economic backdrop just explains when people rediscovered it. Across all these states, the common thread isn't shared memory. A kid in Seattle and a kid in Houston didn't grow up with the same games. The common thread is that when they went looking for something better than the live service treadmill, they found the same design principles waiting for them. Section 7. Putting it all together, the psychology summarized. So let's connect the dots. Old games satisfy intrinsic motivation instead of exploiting operant conditioning. They build flow states instead of chasing variable ratio reinforcement. They build real self-efficacy through effort justification instead of manufacturing shallow dopamine spikes through reward prediction error. They reduce cognitive load instead of triggering the paradox of choice. And globally, across Europe's exploratory drive, Africa's need for competence through accessible design, and America's patchwork of identity fusion, social facilitation, and social identity theory, the same underlying psychological principles keep surfacing in wildly different contexts. That consistency is the whole point. Nostalgia is personal and local. It only works if you were there. But these psychological mechanisms are universal. They work on anyone, in any decade, in any country, whether or not they ever touched the original hardware. Closing. So next time someone says preferring old games is just nostalgia, push back. Nostalgia is real, but what we're describing here is different. It's the difference between intrinsic motivation and compulsion loops, between flow and variable reinforcement schedules, between games that built self-efficacy and games engineered to keep you logged in. Old games didn't need 40 systems and a live service calendar to be great. They just needed to be good once and let you walk away. That's not nostalgia. That's psychology. And it's just good design. Share your experience at the comments section. What are other factors that happen to Gen X? Subscribe/next video suggestion. Have a nice day. From Rot in Stillness.